Thunderer is a legendary tier British battleship and the prize for completing the Summer 2026 Marathon, let's call it. It's the marathon that began in the June 2026 update and I think will run through August. And much like the Kremlin and the Hindenburg marathons that preceded this, I think all you essentially have to do is buy the Admiralty backing for the 2 or 3 campaigns that exist in the duration of the marathon, complete those campaigns, and then just generally play the game enough to acquire the requisite ship parts. And I think this is set up in such a way that the fewest ship parts are available during this patch. Next patch will have a little bit more, and then the third and final patch will have the most. I haven't found in the past that these marathons are all that difficult to complete. If I were a free-to-play player, let's say, I'd still be buying all the campaigns because I think those, even to this day, remain the best value in World of Warships Legends. And then, provided you play the game enough, these marathons, much like the campaigns, seem to complete themselves. So I don't think they're all that bad of a way to get the ships. I've completed the last 2 marathons just as I've completed every campaign for the past, I don't know, 5-6 years without even really paying all that much attention to it. And the Thunderer is probably pretty worth pursuing. I think it's a potent ship, at least in terms of the damage it can dish out, but it is certainly not the tankiest ship at the tier. In fact, I think the survivability, even in spite of it having an improved or super heal, does leave a little bit to be desired, and it's also the kind of ship that I think functions best as sort of a sniper. It's certainly not something you would want to try to brawl with. The armor just isn't there, and it doesn't have a tremendous amount of hit points to begin with, only 82,900, and by the way, 28% torpedo damage reduction, so you certainly don't want to get hit with any of those. I think you'll see later on in this battle, when other battleships shoot at you, it's fairly easy to hit the Thunderer for quite a bit of damage, and its Citadel, which I'll show you now. I think there's going to be a little bit of a lull in the action as we maneuver behind this island. The Citadel is exposed. The belt armor at the waterline is the armor for the Citadel. There's no extra layer for it to go through. So if somebody hits you and pens you in the belt armor, they're going to be citadeling you, and I probably had that happen to me a couple of times, and that's why I don't think you want to take the Thunderer into close brawling range. Near the end of the battle, we should be hit a couple of times by some of these BBs, but for the most part, throughout this entire match, we're going to be playing this rather passively. I'd almost say it's kind of boring, to be honest with you. And that's primarily the reason I picked this battle. It is kind of boring because it is very snipey and passive, but I think that is the playstyle of the Thunderer. Anyway, we've talked about its HP and torpedo damage reduction. We're going to shoot at the Montana, see the fantastic HE in action, and I'll show you the commander build here real quick. It is Azurlane Nelson. And of course, the module selection is pretty standard. Aiming Systems Mod 1, Propulsion, Concealment, Main Battery Reload. On Azurlane Nelson, the 2 inspirations are, of course, Kondo, because Thunderer does have pretty good concealment, and then Kedrov, because the turret traverse without him as inspiration, using Azurlane Nelson in the Big 7 skill, well, it's not exactly fast, and I wanted to buff it a little bit. So, of course, the specs are going to be influenced by this build, but I'll try to give you the base numbers where and when I can. Anyway, let's talk about the main battery guns, since we've covered the survivability. Or actually, you know what? Let's back up a second. We should talk about the heal that the Thunderer has. It's not, I don't think, a super heal. It's an improved heal, though. It restores 537 HP per second, which is probably double the amount of the typical battleship heal. Lasts for 28 seconds, but it's got an 85-second cooldown, which is a little bit longer than your typical heal. As for the main battery guns, which you've seen in action thus far, we've got 78,000 damage done with them right now. A lot of that coming from the fires, which they seem to light practically every time you shoot HE at a target. And that is because this is the most cracked HE in the game. These are 8 457 millimeter or 18-inch guns. Of course, not as quite as large as the Yamatos. They can't overmatch 32 millimeters with the AP, but they can overmatch 30, and of course the AP can be devastating against broadsides there. That's kind of a low damage roll against the Preußen at only 14k. Anyway, these guns have a base range of 16.6, rather short, but with the flammable cannoneer skill, and I think that's the only one that would be influencing the range. With that, we have 18.4 kilometers of range. Reload mod gets us 23.4 second reload. The base is 26. That's a pretty good reload time if you want to be an HE spammer, and this thing certainly can be. But there you see a taste of the AP really getting a good hit, over 23k there on that Preußen. In fact, the Thunderer might be a really good counter to the Preußen. You always see the Preußens out there in the back line wanting to snipe with their ultra-accurate AP guns, but you see, they even have to have a little bit of an unangled ship to get that AP to pen and deal damage. HE doesn't care about your angle. If Thunderer is sniping you from 18 kilometers away with its HE, well, if it's got Azerlane Nelson running Big 7 at the helm, the HE per shell is going to do a maximum damage of 9,512, which is absurd. But even if you don't have Big 7 as a commander skilled or Azerlane Nelson at all, well, the base HE damage is 8,200, which is still ridiculous and gigantic. Also, I think the thing has battle cruiser dispersion, and the sigma value it shows me on this build is 1.94, which may not be all that great. The base is 1.85, but I found these guns to be relatively consistent. They're accurate sometimes, but they remind me of every British battleship's guns, where they do look pinpoint, and then other times the dispersion just lets you down and the shells do not hit what you want them to. As you might imagine, too, this HE is absolutely lethal to destroyers. Another low damage roll on Laffy out there, but I've hit destroyers in excess of 10k. I think last night when I was playing this ship, I hit some DD for 12. Nearly sunk him, not quite. You almost feel bad for him when they get hit that hard, because this HE is just nuclear. But that's not the only thing about it. It also has, on top of its ridiculous damage, a 63% fire chance, which probably doesn't mean a fire is guaranteed every time you land an HE shell on a target, but near enough. I suppose we only have 6 fires so far in this battle, but we've only fired 56 shells, so there's a little bit more to come. The AP, pretty good too. The base AP shell damage is 14,900, and pause for a moment actually. Laffy beaches himself. We get a really accurate roll of the dice with that salvo, and the HE, more than good enough to take him out. There's the second kill of the game, so a little bit of an example of the HE. Anyway, 14,900 is the maximum AP shell damage base, but of course, Azerlane Nelson's Big 7 also increases AP damage, so we've got it up to 17,284. Climbing up to one of the higher AP damage values in the game. However, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend Big 7. I've also been using this with John Fisher, who I think is an excellent choice. And the damage buff that Big 7 gives you is nice, but it also reduces the penetration of both the AP and the HE shells by a fairly significant amount, 16%. And so in the case of Thunderer, the base HE pen is 114 millimeters, reduced to 96 with Big 7. I suppose that might not make that much of a difference in all practicality. And then the AP pen, well, the point-blank AP pen is 849 millimeters, but with Big 7 reduced to 721. Armor pen at max range is 565 without Big 7. With it, 463. So that's a pretty big fall off on the AP pen, especially at maximum range. Choosing to take Big 7 may mean that your AP shells are not going to pen everything they otherwise might if you weren't cutting down the pen, especially at longer ranges. So for that reason, I think it's debatable whether the skill is all that worth it. Maybe it's better to just go with the base damage of both shells and keep the penetration higher. By the way, these AP shells don't have any kind of improved pen angles, nor do I think they're short fuse. The fuse time says 0.033 seconds, which I think is actually standard for most battleships. The thing is, secondaries, they're not worth mentioning. It would be foolish to build into them. This thing cannot brawl at close range. You'll just get chewn up with penetrations through the 32 millimeters of armor everywhere, or else hitting the citadel, and that'll be catastrophic. It does have some AA, also gets the DFAA consumable, along with the enhanced secondary targeting consumable for I don't know why. You don't need the enhanced secondary targeting consumable. Those things are not going to do anything for you. The DFAA, I suppose that helps. This thing I've found can shoot down planes, but I don't know. Like any ship at legendary tier or in the game, I don't really think AA is all that effective of a counter, generally speaking. So it is what it is. But the maneuverability on the ship is kind of absurd. It's got a top speed of 29.5 knots, although I think I'm running the speed flag for an extra knot. I've got it at 30.4. 940 meter turning circle, fairly large, but not as large as some of the battleships at this tier. And a rudder shift with a base time of 10.4 seconds. I have it up to 10.9 for some reason. I don't know what is nerfing it. Maybe some skill on Azerlane Nelson. But yeah, 10.4. That's the base rudder shift. That means, especially at longer ranges, you are to a large degree able to dodge incoming fire if you're going at full half speed and then you make a turn with that rudder. It's kind of absurd, to be honest with you. And then finally, the concealment. Well, I have it down to 12.4 km with the condo inspiration. And those of you out there who disagree with my philosophy for building into battleship concealment, you might want to take my advice on this one. If you just use the concealment mod, the detect is going to be somewhere in the 13 km range. And I can pretty much guarantee you, if you're focused down by people who don't want to be tortured by your HE, they probably are not going to have that hard of a time killing you. One of the main strengths of Thunderer will be its ability to stay at range where it can have success, farm things down with HE in a fairly boring manner, to be honest with you, but an effective one. And if you're able to go dark after every salvo and more accurately control the engagement, that's probably going to improve your chances of having success in the ship. You are probably not going to find any success if you're constantly spotted all the time and being focused. The thing just doesn't have enough tools, I don't think, to sustain itself generally. But it is a damage dealer. 235,000 in that game, 3,224 base XP. This is, I suppose you could say, an HE sniper, and probably one of the best in the game. Certainly one of the most powerful HE battleships in the entire British line. And I think it's well worth completing the marathon to get, although the ship I feel like could be kind of toxic with how ridiculous the HE is. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.